Hello and welcome to another episode of FinTech Focus TV, powered by Harrington Starr, global leaders in financial technology recruitment. Head over to harringtonstar.com where you'll be able to see some of the greatest jobs in financial technology recruitment across the world. You'll also be able to find a host of insight to help you grow your brand, your team, your network and your career. You can see the latest financial technology salary survey. You'll be able to download the issue of the Financial Technologist, focusing on the appetite for disruption. And our latest Top 1% Workplace Awards will be out at the end of this year. If you work for a company that's a great place to work in financial technology, we want to hear from you. Enjoy the show, and I'll see you soon. Hello and welcome to another episode of FinTech Focus TV with me, Toby. Today we're on the subject of data, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to Martin French, who is the Chief Data Officer of Apex. Martin, how are you?
I'm well, thanks, Tony. How are you?
Very good indeed, thank you. Very good indeed. So listen, we've been having a little chat beforehand about all things data. I've given you my views, which I've trotted out on this show at various different stages. I'm excited about the potential of data in financial services, and I think there's a really interesting pathway for what we can do and what you were talking about beforehand as well. Looking forward to getting into all of that. But as always, before we get into the meat of everything, I want to hear a little bit about you, your journey, and also Apex Group and what you guys are doing and how you're changing the world.
Yeah, sure. Let's start with Apex Group, shall we? So global financial services provider, for over 20 years established now. 94 offices globally, somewhere in the region of about 12,000 plus employees. I think on last count, we're 37 or 38 different jurisdictions around the globe. Massive hypergrowth over the past 5 years. We do a lot of different services. We do digital solutions for asset managers, other financial institutes, private clients. So we've got a huge amount of data that sits in the background of that. And this is obviously why my role here exists. My personal journey, I've gone through a number of different sectors over the years. I actually fell into technology by accident 20 odd years ago.
I know that story.
Yeah. It happens to almost everybody, I think. I've worked in financial services for credit card companies, insurance data providers. I've worked in B2B2C environments, and I'm actually doing a number of different roles in those, not necessarily specifically database related roles such as DBAs or data engineering roles such as ETL developers, but also actually in application development and system administration and various other bits and pieces. And in the past 10 years or so, I've dived more heavily into the management side of data and taken my career from there. I actually came on board with Apex as part of the acquisition of San Group. And that was, it's over a year ago now, I think. I can't tell you the date. Actually, I can't remember, Tony. But actually, as we've come into this, it's given us a really good viewpoint of a number of different services that the businesses provide and all the data that flows behind those. And actually, the growth on that is huge. And it's a really exciting time because we've got a lot we can do with this. We've done a lot already, but the journey is an evolutionary one. It's not going to stop, I don't think.
So what does that look like? Because I'm always interested in this because, as you say, there's loads you can do. There's loads of data behind all of this. You talked about scale and size there. That's hugely impressive. And look, there's about 15 questions I want to ask all at once to you. When you talk about what you've done already and what you can do, what does that actually look like?
That's a good question. One of the first things that you need to do within any business that you're approaching from a data standpoint is start looking at actually, what does the business look like? And that sounds like a crazy question. It's obvious what the business looks like. It's lots of people doing lots of work. What I mean is, where is the business going? What's the strategic direction? What is the current state of now? And how is the data moving around and supporting that current business? So what we did is came into the business, had a look and said, there are a number of areas here where we can start to push forward with data. We can look at building internal data platforms for usage and analytics and business intelligence. We can look at how we take operational data and are we keeping that safe and secure? We can look at all the regulations and all the different compliance points that we need to around that data and start forming a strategy that takes us forward. So with this particular business, I've looked at this from a dual strategy. So there's a strategy internally to the business, which is what we call a defensive strategy, in so much as we look at how we make sure that we are compliant, we're keeping our regulators happy, we're looking internally to make sure controls are in place and data governance is strong internally. But also then we're looking at the offensive strategies, which is how can we service our clients better? How can we deliver a better solution, a better experience, and a better product to our clients going forward? So what we've done so far is we've started pulling together that strategy. We've looked at some of the mechanisms that we can utilize in the technology space to drive those initiatives forward. And ultimately now we're in the process of building the teams that underpin that take us forward. And some of my colleagues within my team are looking at how other areas enhance that, things with like workflow, for instance, robotic process automation, how we leverage AI within the financial arenas to again, provide all of those benefits to our clients, but also from a defensive point of view. Can we look at anti-money laundering in an automated fashion? Can we look at event management, for instance, and how we help our clients spot fraudulent activity? All of these things are the art of the possible within this environment, and these are some of the exciting directions that we want to be going in, and very soon.
I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? And probably one that doesn't get broadcast enough. I think people talk about data a lot. We've heard all the headlines, data's the new gold. We've heard the headlines about how transformational it can be for financial services. And yet I always feel that there's a lot of nodding towards data, and we need to invest in data, et cetera, et cetera. And there are companies that get that right and get enormous benefits from it. I think there's data, as you say, on the defensive side of it, where people are looking at there and they say the kind of necessary evil and what can we do with it? And then where I think there's transformational opportunity is then saying, how can we take this further forward and really increase efficiency and increase information and put the front end of our business into a game-changing opportunity where decisions are made better, where information goes out to make things easier and more efficient for everyone else. I always look at it from a sporting background, where I think data has been used over the last few years in a pretty transformational way in a number of top tier sports, where people are making the right runs at the right time to be able to score goals, score tries, make more runs, concede less, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's all about visualization and then the data to then create action, to then create results. And I think that's got to be the piece there where people are looking at all of this thing. When you talked about this, the amount of data that you've got there as a business with 94 different offices, there is enormous amount of opportunity in that, right? There's enormous amount of opportunity for your customers to be bigger, brighter, and better. When you're looking at all of that data, where does it start?
That's a great question. I'm not sure it's one that's easily answered. So looking at this from a strategic standpoint, and to your point about sports is a great one, right? So I'm a motorbike fan and I watch all the big events. And one of the things that I never really realize is actually how much data they're collecting around everything that's happening with a bike during its running period on a racetrack. That premise is the same irrespective of whether it's a motorbike, whether it's a sports person, whether it's a business, whether it's a vehicle. It's about making sure that at the very heart of things, that the collection of the data is done properly and is done to a level where the data can actually be useful. Many years ago, somebody once said to me, we'll collect all of the data that we can about this. That's a great idea until actually you realize that out of all of that data you're collecting, probably only about 30 to 40% of it is useful. And actually you're paying for the 60 to 70% for no use. So where we start is actually by understanding what data is of value to the business. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that a lot of the data isn't valuable. It means it's just not valuable right now. I'm building that foundation, and it's like building a house out of Lego bricks. You're not going to start building the roof first. You've got to put that to one side. You need to get your big green sheet and start putting your blocks on. Say, this is my foundation, and I want this really fanciful, Hogwarts style castle built in Lego. You've got to start right at the very bottom. And I think that's a good analogy on the premise that actually you are building a Hogwarts castle out of Lego when it comes to data sometimes. There is so much of it. There are so many different halls. There are so many different avenues. There's so many different towers. And each one needs its own focus. But again, pulling back to that piece about you've got to collect the data right. It needs to be well governed. It needs to be accurate. It needs to be kept in a safe and secure manner. And taking care of those things first is the direction that every data leader will be taking. It's just beyond that, it's very business driven. There's a lot of firefighting in terms of the defensive strategy, absolutely. But in terms of the client strategy, which is where we're putting a very heavy focus, we need to understand our clients' needs, and they are going to change regularly. Looking at that from, you could use the Harry Potter piece again, and you're walking into a hall where the stairways are always moving, right?
Yes.
That could be a very good way of describing how data moves with its technology and how we're moving forward as a business. Strike back to 20 years ago when Apex was just forming, data had a different value in people's eyes. And now I'm having conversations with other data leaders about How do we get data as an asset on the balance sheet? How does that actually value a business? Can we change the way, that the FTSE 100 looks, or the NICE looks, by way of saying, actually, there is a value line for data here? Because to your point earlier about data being gold, and I think that's the better of the ones I've heard, people keep saying it's oil and it's not, but that's oil's burnt and it's gone. Data is always going to be there.
Yeah,
Much like gold, you melt it down and you form something else with it. So that's a great one to take forward. And I am going to steal that. But ultimately,
I did.
well, that's how we do it, right? We share information, we share knowledge. But yeah, I think particularly for Apex, on this journey, we've got a lot of different things we can do for our clients with data. And there's the opportunity for us to also do the data work for our clients, and taking away the pressure of actually having to build big data teams and have data storage. It's not cheap, right? But if we could take some of that pain away. One of the big areas that we're looking at the moment now, which is hot off the press, is ESG data. When people want to start looking at the ESG capabilities of another business, of a fund, of any of these different directions, we have got the capability now within Apex to actually provide that kind of information. And I see that actually as a big thing across many businesses going forwards. People want more ESG data. They want to know, how well are their companies behaving? How well are their clients behaving? And looking at that ESG data, it gives us a good idea of that. It takes care of the greenwashing problem and it starts to give us more intelligence. But the evolution of that for me is actually, where else can that go? We've got the ESG piece and that's great, but let's start looking at predictive models and say your ESG rating might be here. What's that ESG rating going to look like in comparison to climate change, to other given areas, and start looking at the different components that make that up? And it's just one of those lines that you start to follow, and you can ultimately end up with a suite of new products created from data out of that, just by starting to explore that data a little bit further. And we've got people in-house that are actually just looking at data. What does this data mean? Why does it look that way? What is there? And that's the whole premise behind data science, and understanding that sometimes you need an answer to a question you don't yet know you need to ask.
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating, and this is why I love this whole thing, and it really resonates to me, and the way my head works is looking at that sort of thing and telling the story is, to me, what data is all about, isn't it? Is being able to look through a whole heap of information and say, what does this actually mean? How can we make improvements from it? From, as you say, a defensive side or an offensive side. And I think it's a really interesting piece, because you talked about the size and scale. Remind me of I know you said 94 different offices, etc.
Yeah,
but
94 offices, 12,000 plus employees and growing, 38 countries. I think it is.
Yeah, so that's extraordinary. So 12,000 plus people. Taking that sort of data into it. You're based, I believe you said earlier on, over in Nottingham.
I live in Nottingham. My office is London.
London, okay, yeah. You've got 38 different countries, which you talked about as well, that you're dealing with. From a data perspective, and you've been sat there, and I want to talk about the CDO itself, because I think it's, again, in position, which is growing quite nicely, but I think it's such an integral position into companies. I've been imploring people to think about that as a genuine C-suite position, and as I'm sure you're very passionate about as well. But when you're looking at that and you're sat there as a chief data officer in a business of that size and scale across that sort of geography, how's that set up, just even logistically?
Another good question. So this one is a topic of some debate in CDO circles. Okay, so we can do this a number of different ways, and it is usually very related to what your business is looking for specifically. See, in my mind, two different sorts of CDO. You've got the very heavily technical CDOs, building data platforms and teams and analytics. And then you've got the very strategic ones and taking the business forward with data products and utilizing paradigms such as data mesh and such. For me, I like to sit somewhere in the middle of those, because I think that you do need both. However, there are so many different facets to being a CDO that actually you can get very mired very quickly. So how do I get this set up and get this working? Simple. My team underneath me is the driving force behind all of this. So I split into 4 pillars within the CDO world, which is governance, operations, insights, and analytics and products. And those 4 key areas for delivering data actually have their own level set of responsibilities that they can drive forward. So if we take a look at insights, which is probably the one that people are most excited about, that's analytics, it's business intelligence, it's management information, but it's also data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of those pieces of real cognitive analytics, thinking like a human with code. Each one of those individual areas drives its way forward, and each one they have to interoperate. So the CDO is orchestrating that and bringing that together and making sure
The
that
conductor.
absolutely, yeah. I could do with a big wavy stick for this sometimes, I'm sure. But it is a big responsibility. It's not an easy task, but my team make it easier. So I'm a big believer in people. I'm a big believer that they are the driving force behind this. And that there is an element to being a CDO about being a salesperson. I was having a conversation with a CDO about this the other day. You tend to see within data that the bigger the salesman, the CDO, usually the more successful they are, right? And it's simply because you're selling a story with data. You're selling a capability with data. You're convincing the business that this is the right direction to go in. Why it's the right direction to go in. And you're convincing them to invest in an area where actually sometimes you won't get a result out of it, particularly in the data science world. And no answer is an answer.
So let me put on that quickly, because I think this is one of the issues which data is starting to move through personally, which is where you've got people, particularly in financial services, who are pretty, as a massive generalization, but in financial services who are generally pretty ego-led. For want of a better description, which means that they've come through and they've got the t-shirt, they've been in it for ages, they've been successful to be up at that sort of stage, and they've got intuition. And intuition says, this is the way we should be doing things around here. Then you've got a data team who are looking at things and saying, look, the data says something that could be different in terms of how those are going. And you have the ego of someone at the top of a tree who's there to do it. Now, this is where I think the sales piece really comes into it, because I think there's a lot of people there who will nod to data and listen. Does that chime into some of the conversations you've been having with other CDOs?
Yeah, there's certainly some of the behaviors that we talk about. But actually, one of the things that I find is a change in behavior is that as you present more data that actually either supports or counters what an individual is saying about their gut feel, if you can give them the underlying data and says, hey, look, these are your thoughts, this is your trajectory, this is, I don't know, this might be your projected revenue return. Let's follow that. Let's track the data. Let's bring that together and let's see how close you are. And then at the end, do a lessons learned. And it might be, they are spot on. Great, brilliant. Let's have a look at how we can take that further. Or they're out by a margin. Let's have a look where your gut feel was different and what it was that led you to that number when the data leads us to this number. And actually working with the business in that manner, rather than saying, no, you're wrong, the data's always right. Because this is a controversial point of view. The data isn't always right. The data is only as right as what's input. And it leads me back to that foundational piece about collecting data and its quality. So working with the business in that way for me is far more valuable than me trying to smack them down and say, no, your intuition is wrong. These people wouldn't be in these positions if their intuition was always wrong. There's something there. I want to follow that. I want to support that. I want to understand that and say, how can we give you data that makes that intuition work? How can we give you data that supports your decision faster? It's not about us telling you that you're wrong. I'm not telling anybody that they're wrong. I'm saying, okay, can we compare? I want to see what our data looks like in comparison to yours, how you got to that journey. Let's look at those inputs. Let's look at the start, because sometimes doing that will take you back to a differential between a revenue, for instance, just as an example. They might say, oh, it's 200,000. And we might say, actually, it's 20,000. But they're starting with a different data set that we're not aware of. And that might be, oh, we don't have that. Let's pull that into the equation and let's start again. Oh, now you're at 20, I'm at 22. We're golden. Or conversely, it might be, oh, you're missing this factor. We have that data here. Have some more data on that and take that forward and enhance that. And working with the business in that way, for me, is far more successful than trying to stop somebody using their intuition.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think you're absolutely right on that. It's about working with rather than against. And I think that's where the best of it happens, right? The chief data officer, I think, is a really interesting position, and it's one which has grown in significance and volume, I think, as much as anything else over the years. Still, though, I think the common roles would be CIO, CTO, etc. Where if you look at a C-suite, inevitably going to have a CRO, you're inevitably going to have a CEO, you're inevitably going to have a CEO. And this CDO with the transformational opportunity to make things better in a business is still something which is a growing C-suite position. So tell me a little bit about your journey to becoming a CDO. Tell me a little bit about what that, you've intimated a little bit about what that means. But tell me why you think it's such a significant position in the company, and when should a company scale from having people who work in data through to saying we need to have a CDO? Is it a size thing? Is it a scale thing? Is it a data thing?
We'll start with that one because it's an interesting topic of conversation. So just a little context here. If you go back 20, 25 years, CTO, CIO, very new roles as technology starts to become emerging as a forefront runner in capability. There were newish roles, but they were still quite well defined. I think the lines of those may be a little different for different businesses, but ultimately, you're right. Broadly speaking, CIO, CTO, very established.
There's a cost at that sort of stage, wasn't it? When I started
It was,
25 years ago, you had IT directors and you had people who look at that and saying that they didn't have a seat. The frustration 25 years ago was people didn't have a seat at the board realistically if they were in IT. They were a cost and a necessary evil at that sort of stage. And it was there's the business and there's your technology team. And then it started to mesh over, didn't it? Over
That's right, yes.
5 to 10 year period. And all of a sudden, the CTO was fundamental, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years, I think, of where it's been fundamental to the whole process.
And you put it beautifully. We're on that same journey with CDO. Where are we in that? I think different businesses are at different stages, and that's a number of factors. So it depends on the focus of the business. Is there a heavy focus on data in what they do? Everybody's got data. Everybody uses data. But is the business a data business? And I don't say a data-driven business, a data business. So you take the credit reference agencies, for instance. They aren't credit reference agencies, they're data businesses. It just so happens that credit data is their data. For us, we've got a wealth of different data in a number of different sectors where we operate. So are we a data business? We are on our way there. And this role sits very well with that. But for a smaller business that perhaps isn't, Acme Widgets Co., for instance, they're just using revenue data, that could be a very small data team, 2 to 3 people, maybe from a 200-300 business. If all your business is doing is selling widgets and that's it, you could operate with quite a small data team. Does that need a CDO? Perhaps not. Provided somebody is driving data at a C-suite level, that's the most important bit. And controversially, for me, absolutely is the most important bit, whether that's a CTO, a CIO, a CDO, or even chief operating officer, chief revenue officer. These people, somebody needs to be on the side of data. Going back, traditionally it was CFOs because of the FP&A, the financial planning and analytics piece that happens around finance. But data now has grown beyond that into a much bigger area. And that's not me saying we don't need FP&A. Absolutely, we need FP&A. But what I'm saying is there's a lot of the data analysis that takes place is not just financial analysis and therefore requires a bigger function. And some of the other CDOs I talk to have actually taken FP&A into data. Usually they're aligned within the CFO arena, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. Again, I was having this conversation the other day. One of my friends who's also a CDO, he has gone into the COO, he's reported into the CFO, he's had a seat at the table himself and stood alone. And all of these are models, and the maturity of that role may define where that ends up. But for me, again, it's about somebody at the top table, somebody at a C-suite level, somebody has got data at the forefront of their mind if you want to deliver out of data.
I absolutely agree with everything you're saying there. And I think sometimes the CTO generally tends to absorb that into their sort of suite. And again, my concern about that is it part of the team or is it something there which is really going to be driven and owned? I look at one of my favorite ever books was Clive Humby's piece called Scoring Points on Tesco. I don't know if you ever read it, but I started reading it after reading Terry Leahy's book about the transformation of Tesco. Data was the answer and Club Card was the vehicle that allowed them to make decisions, that allowed them to attract clients, that took them from the 3rd biggest grocer in the country to comfortably by a mile the biggest grocer in the country. And I look at that, and for me, it's always been exactly the same thing. We put it into our business and say, how can we use data to make people faster, better, and stronger at what they're doing in the business? How can we make informed decisions off the information that we're looking at? And I think it makes a transformational difference in what we do in a 60-person recruitment business by trade. I think we then look at it from our customers and say, are they utilizing data here that can dramatically enhance their business? And if I look at it from a financial services macro sector, there is so much data in there that allows the same sort of opportunities that Tesco sat on to make better customer experiences hyper-personalized experiences for them that allows them to do that, even down to the stacking. I love the idea of someone buying a tin of beans in Stockport, and then that triggers a data reaction that allows people to say we need to plant more in Bogota or wherever it might be. Driven by data is something that I find absolutely fascinating. And I think what you're talking about there is having people there who are looking at that and saying, this is something here where as you said, I completely get that whole thing of IT director to CTO, from senior data people then turning into the CDO piece, which can become a bedrock of the next 10, 15 years. Is that where you see this heading?
Yeah, I believe so. It's an interesting point you make about the data value chain, and ultimately that's what that person should be doing. Yeah. And it doesn't matter who that is. To your point about CTOs leading the data teams, yes, that's quite a common one that I've seen as well. But then I'd question within that, are you giving analytics the right amount of attention? Because CTO being very technical, analytics is not necessarily a technical field.
It's creative, isn't it? That's what I think. When I look at people who are great with data, it's not just a technical play. It is a creative and it's a business play to then be able to translate and take that in. So that, and this is another interesting evolution for me. And this is why I'm loving this conversation, by the way. But this is another transformation for me, because going back again 25 years, you had technology as technology being classic, old school stereotypes of what technology was. People who had their headphones on, didn't want to speak to anyone, and cracked on with their job. And that was those guys in the corner doing their thing. Now, I think every technologist is someone there who's got much more of a business understanding. They had a technology understanding beforehand, saying, can I make this work and what do I need to do? And I think that's morphed a lot over the last couple of decades into people there who are business people who understand technology. And that's a really interesting transition for me about what's needed. And from a recruitment perspective, when we're talking to people, we're not just looking at tech skills, we're looking at business and commercial understanding alongside that.
Yeah, absolutely. Within the analytics space, soft skills are just as important as tech skills. One of the things that I always say is that skills can be learned, attitudes can't. It takes a long time to change an attitude. I could train skills into people. Giving somebody the capability and putting data in their hands actually will usually send them on their own path if they've got the right mindset around it. And that's not saying technical people don't, quite far from it. And that can go both ways. So when you take a business intelligence developer, for instance, they're looking at data, they might be wrangling data, they're pulling it through their insert tool of choice here. But then they're taking that into a visualization and telling a story with it, a visual story with that data. And data storytelling is a really important part about analytics. And it's about having the underlying raw data that then you can then craft into something that's meaningful to somebody else that doesn't necessarily understand how data flows and works together. So absolutely, there is a creative element there. Conversely, when you start looking within the engineering spaces and the more technical arenas, there is still that I need to get data from point A to point B. How do I do that? And there is a creative piece there around what tools have I got? What are the capabilities? Where am I going? What does the governance look like? How do we make sure that we're tracking every bit of data as it moves through our systems? How are we getting that into a catalog so that when users are searching for it, when your business intelligence is trying to build their stories, how can they find that data as well? So there's also a number of other areas that we need to look at. It gets blurry when you get into the technical worlds of data as to whether that is a development function or whether that's in an analytical and creation. It gets very blurry, and that's why I think the CDO role is critical. It's having that purview over all of that and understanding that each of those areas has its own, and managing those areas as well means that, it comes back to that multifaceted thing I mentioned earlier, the many faces of the CDO. You're managing technical people, you're managing creative people, but to your point, you're managing business people as well that have got business knowledge. And ultimately, there's so many different arenas within that, and the capability of those individuals sometimes just absolutely astounds me. It really does.
It's so many different skills, isn't it? And you mentioned it there. And actually, I think that chunking of it is really interesting, because I think going back to the Tesco example, it's a sales tool, right? This is how you can push things out. If you look at it in a sales and marketing perspective, the ability to get the right offers at the right time to the right people, and the ease of the sales team to make that process is, I think, the responsibility of businesses everywhere at the moment is to make it as easy as possible for people to be as successful as possible within that company. So from an Apex perspective and in your business, it's how does the technology team, how does the data team, how do you as the CDO make working for that business as easy as possible? When we're talking about retention and
people moving from a headcount perspective, when you talked about the growth that you've been on, when you talked about 12,000 people in 38 countries and all those different offices, that is a complicated piece to do it. And I think if you're looking at retention of staff on that sort of volume and replacement of staff and the cost therein of doing that, if you can add another 6 to 12 months on general retention of people because their job is easy and better and they are more successful because of it, that's a massive, that just signifies the utter significance of the role that you're doing within that business. And it's got to be a key driver to that. And that's a really business orientated commercial function to allow people to be able to play that, and to do that, to have that commercial function, you've got to have a commercial understanding of what people are trying to do. And when
absolutely. So again, this is another hot topic around the CDOs at the moment, and that's retention and hiring. So talking specifically to retention, I think that we need to be people as much as we might be technical people or creative or artistic, but we still, as CDOs, need to be people. Everybody in the team should have a voice. Everybody in the team should have access to those at the top.
Yeah.
And Apex does this across all areas. There's a very flat structure. If you want to bring the CEO. And that, for me, should, obviously, we don't want them to be escalating that my pencil's broken. It takes me 4 minutes to get to the local stationery club, and I don't like that. There are mechanisms in place to deal with those kind of problems, but the ability to question, where are we going? What are we doing? And I try and communicate that out to my teams whenever we can, as we get a change in direction or a change in strategies, get that information cascaded. Because knowledge is power, and this is why I'm in data, but ultimately getting that information down to everybody so that they all understand, but also letting them know that they do have a say in this, because they are a part of this. Their contribution matters. They are valued, and as insignificant as they may believe a specific piece of work is, it is always significant. Otherwise, we wouldn't give it them. On the flip side of that as well is keeping people engaged, keeping people learning, keeping people excited about what they're doing and how they're getting their career fed by us as a business. And we want to retain people. Hiring people is expensive. You spend a lot of time and effort getting the right people through the door.
Yeah.
You want to hold on to them, but treat them fairly, treat them right, give them the opportunities that they seek within their career, give them some progression lines as well, and ultimately allow them to grow with the business, but also accept that sometimes that growth together will end and that you'll part ways, and give them a handshake, a thank you, and you're welcome to come back, should you wish to do.
I think this is incredibly important. I was speaking about that exactly the same topic yesterday. There was a company who were brilliantly honest, and I think I encourage this, saying, look, in a final interview, and they've offered this lady, and this lady was pushing back, saying, I'm not sure how to take this. And we were saying, what was the question? And they basically said, look, at the end of 18 months, 2 years, you'll be in a much better position for your CV at that sort of stage. And yes, we want to keep you over that sort of 4 or 5 year period. But at the end of it, if we can't match your ambition, you're going to have a CV that's much more valuable. So they see their job as effectively making people valuable and more attractive to the marketplace out there. Their responsibility is then to say, we're the best place for you to be working, and we'll get the best place for your career, and we're going to give you those sort of options. But I think people are starting to understand now that the years of carriage clocks for 20 years, 25 years service, etc., particularly in technology, aren't particularly common. So how can we make that experience as great as possible for those people? How can we invest in those people over that sort of time? How can we see them and give them pathways through the business to be able to grow and progress? And then at the end of it, if we do part, as you say, have a great experience on departure and make sure the doors are open for return at some sort of stage. And if you do that, I think it really benefits. And the cost savings in that alone are absolutely exceptional in terms of what people can do as a business. Martin, I said at the start of this that half an hour just disappears when you're having fun in certain conversations. We've gone considerably over it, which is a bad habit of mine. But it's a bad habit when I'm passionate about subjects. And I think what you're talking about here is something there which I'm incredibly excited about. I've really valued everything you've said today, and I've really enjoyed having you on the show. So thanks so much for joining us today. If people want to find out a little bit more about Apex Group, if people want to find out a little bit more about you and the data journey and the opportunities therein and everything else in between, I get the impression it's something you enjoy talking about.
Absolutely.
What's the best way for them to reach out to you and find out more?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find apexgroup.com, a wealth of information about the business as well. So head on over. Obviously being technical, everything's online, right? So sure. Find me on LinkedIn. Drop me a note if you want to add me and have a conversation. But yeah, always happy to talk about this stuff.
Look, there's a lot more to get into, and I'd love to have you back on the show at some stage soon as well. But Martin, for now, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for joining us on FinTech Focus TV today.
No, thank you.
Absolute pleasure, and thank you all for watching. We will see you soon on another episode of FinTech Focus TV. Thanks a lot.